In this video, I will introduce a very important concept in hypothesis testing, type 1 and type 2 errors. Although there is very little computation to do around this concept, mastering the idea of type 1 and type 2 errors is fundamental to your understanding of statistics. Let's take a closer look at 4 different outcomes we can get by performing hypothesis testing. Out of the 4 outcomes, 2 are desirable. That is, when the null is false, we reject it, or when the null is true, we fail to reject it. The remaining 2 outcomes are not so desirable. The first one is null is true, but we end up rejecting it. This is known as a type 1 error. The second one is null is false, but we fail to reject it. This is known as type 2 error. Let's use one of the earlier examples we worked on to demonstrate these 2 errors and their relationship. We performed a lower tail test in that example, and the critical value is on the left side of the curve for a lower tailed test. We would have to reject the null whenever the test statistic from the data is on the left side of this critical value. If the null is true in reality, we would still reject it whenever the test statistic lies on the left side of this critical value. We are making an error, taking an action that is to reject the null when it is not justified because the null is true. Type 1 error happens for the lower tailed corner of the curve, and the probability of making type 1 error is actually the significance level alpha we have discussed earlier. When we work on a problem, when alpha is given to be 5%, this actually means we are allowed to make type 1 error up to 5% of the time. Type 2 errors happens for false null hypotheses. We have to assume null is false, so that means alternative is true. The bell curve presented here is actually different from the previous bell curve. Its center is on the left side of the previous curve. We also draw a vertical line to represent the critical value. That's going to be the same as previous one. We have already discussed that we reject the null whenever the test statistics is on the left side of this critical value. If the null is false in reality, we would fail to reject it whenever the test statistics lies on the right side of this critical value. We are making an error, failing to act, that is failing to reject the null when an action or conclusion is called for, because the null hypothesis is false. The probability of type 2 errors is the upper tailed area for this lower tailed test, and is usually called beta. I also placed the 2 plots on top of each other to let you see the connection between these 2 sources of error. Every single error can be conceptualized as either a type 1 or type 2 error. Type 1 and type 2 errors can be summarized again in this following table. Many textbooks like to discuss these errors using the American system of criminal justice, which is innocent until proven guilty. Here, we use a somewhat different example to demonstrate these 2 types of error. We consider the subject is not infected with COVID as null, and the subject is infected as alternative. Type 1 error would be when in reality the subject is not infected, but we conclude he is, so it is a false positive. On the other hand, if the subject is indeed infected, but we conclude he is not, so this type of error is going to be type 2 error, and this is a false negative. These 2 outcomes are not correct and desirable. Unfortunately, it is inevitable to make this type of 1 or type 2 errors. This also concludes the video, and I will see you in the next one.